Good day, dear students. Now let's begin our lecture. Today we are going to speak about the history of translation. Have you ever thought about the history of translation, initial steps of translation? So today we are going to speak about initial steps of translation and about Western translation history and Eastern translation history. If you are ready, we can begin. Today we analyze the difference between two parts of the world. So the word translation comes from Latin and it means to bring or carry across. Sometimes from ancient Greek it means to speak across. So the question comes, why did they need translation in the history? What did they need for? Here the question comes. Why did they need translation in ancient history? And who were the translators in the history? They needed for communication. For communication? Why? Why did they need communication and how? Who were the translators? That's the question. So we are going to find the answer in the further presentation. Especially for communication, they used slaves. Greeks and Romans used their slaves to interpret them orally because as slaves were sold, they moved from one place into another, and that's why they got to know two languages, and that's why they used slaves as interpreters. And the history of translation is traced out from 3000 BC, and Rosetta Stone is considered the most ancient work of translation, belonging to the 2nd century BC. After the invention of printing, the first paper book was printed. It was the 3rd century BC. It is said the first significant translation in the Western world was the Hebrew Bible in the 3rd century, and this book was translated by the translators. After the invention of printing, the Bible has been translated into many languages, from biblical languages of Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. As from in 2018 till this year, full Bible has been translated into many languages, 683 languages, and so on. So initial language of Bible was Hebrew language. This kind of language is sometimes called classical Hebrew, and this is archaic form of Hebrew language. And Bible continues to be the most translated book in the world. Yes, until 2018, at least one of the part of the book was translated into 2,400 of the 6,000 languages. In the later periods, ancient Greek texts were also translated by Roman poets and were adapted to develop literary works for entertainment. And it was formed by Cicero. He mainly translated speaker's speech. He was against word-for-word translation. The debate about sense-for-sense translation and word-for-word translation was prolonged for a long time. Word-for-word translation is a literal translation when the translator tries to find individual words of original as closely as possible to individual words of the target language. It is called the word-for-word translation. Now let's move to the history of Eastern translation, and it's connected especially with the rendering of religious, particularly Buddhist. In Asia, especially Chinese culture influenced translation. An initial step to translation in the East was the translation of the Avesta into Persian. Initial language was Iranian. It was translated into Persian language. Translation of Quran, the holy book. How was it? What was the history of translation of Quran? Are you interested in it? Now in the present slide you can see about this. So Muslims argued that the Quranic text shouldn't be translated. It should be isolated because in order to keep the origin, it shouldn't be translated. But still, translators tried to translate it into several languages. The first person who translated the Quran's Salman Persian. He translated Surah Al-Fatih from Arabic into Persian language during the early 7th century. Surah Al-Fatih was translated by him. Quran translated into several languages. You can see 114 languages, and a lot of people were against was translation, but still, fully it was completely translated into 47 languages of the world. But partially it was translated into 414 languages, but fully into 47 languages. Later on, translation schools were founded by early translators both in West and East translation world. And these schools were called translation schools. Now we'll speak about these schools. One of them is Toledo School of Translators. It was very famous in the history, where the translators worked on different works. They translated from one language into another. It was hard work and initial schools for translators. Traditionally, Toledo was a center of multilingual culture and had prior importance as a center of learning and translation, beginning its era under the Muslim rule. And you can see parts of the process of translation in Toledo School. People are sitting, discussing about the translation, arguing of the meaning of different phrases from one language into another. And you can see also parts of the Toledo School, some translators sitting together and doing the translation with the help of some written books. You can see another picture concerning to all Toledo schools, how they were sitting. There was no computer there was no net. They only wrote with the ink, with a pen. The ink especially tried to write with their own hand all the copies. The School of Translators, Toledo, was a group of translators and scholars who worked in the city of Toledo during the 12th and 13th century. They translated works from in Arabic and in Hebrew. Especially they were very busy. When the Gutenberg printing press was invented in the 15th century, this gave way for the mass production of copies of written texts were spread, and it helped to multiply the copies. Martin Luther, a German monk, took advantage of this and produced a German translation of the New Testament in 1522, and he was the founder of translation school in Germany. While translation in the past was reserved for monks, linguists, and scholars, today it has become a booming industry that spans the globe, and it became a very global industry that earns much money during a year. Now we'll come closer with it. In the next following page, you can see the modern booth of interpreters, how it developed with a modern equipment, with a microphone, with the translation tools that easily can translate with the help of different kind of CAT. CAT means computer assistant tools. Easily they can translate one thing in 2 or 3 minutes, while in the history they translated daily or 10 days or 40 days. Up to today, one translator can translate in 2 days or in 1 day 100-page books. So how much do they pay? How much do the industry of translation earns over a year? You can see the sums on the screen, and you can see the information about the payment for per word for translators in European and American countries. In different countries, they are paid this sum of money per word that you can see on the screen. And that was all shortly about the history of translation. Thank you very much for your attention. It was all about Western and Eastern translation history, and I do hope that you got some information about today's lesson. Thank you very much for attending, for being with me. Thank you very much.